The third time she asked about my pension, I almost didn't notice. We were sitting around my son's kitchen table in Denver, sharing a pot of chili I'd made from my late wife's recipe, and Vanessa was asking the kinds of questions that seemed perfectly polite on the surface. How long had I worked for the county? Did I have a good retirement package? Did I manage my own investments or work with someone? My son laughed it off, told her I was the most financially conservative man alive, that I kept my money in 3 different banks just to be safe. She laughed too. I laughed too. But something small and cold settled in the back of my mind. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for Jefferson County, Colorado. I built bridges, literally. I know how to read load-bearing structures, how to spot stress fractures before they become catastrophes, how to see the invisible fault lines in things that look perfectly solid from the outside. My wife Susan always said I had the same instinct with people. She said I could smell a crack in a foundation before anyone else even thought to look. Susan passed 2 years ago. Heart failure. Sudden. A Tuesday morning in February. She was 61. I still reach for her side of the bed sometimes. I still catch myself saving the punchline of a joke to tell her later, then remembering all over again. My son was devastated. He and his mother were close in a way that some fathers might have been jealous of, but I never was. I thought it was beautiful. After she died, I watched him grieve, watched him pull back from everything and everyone for about 8 months. Then, slowly, he started coming back to life. He started running again. He started calling me more. And then, about 14 months ago, he told me he'd met someone. Her name was Vanessa. She was 31, worked as a pediatric nurse at a hospital in Aurora, loved hiking and old movies and making elaborate Sunday breakfasts. When I met her the first time, she was warm and funny and attentive. She looked at my son the way Susan used to look at me across a room, like he was the most interesting person in it. I liked her. I genuinely liked her, which is exactly why it took me longer than it should have to pay attention to the cracks. The first time she asked about my finances, it was easy to wave away. We were talking about retirement in general terms, the way you do when an older person is at the table. She asked if I had a financial advisor. I said no. I managed things myself. She nodded and seemed genuinely curious. The second time was at Thanksgiving. My son had cooked. First Thanksgiving since Susan, and we were all trying to be brave about it. Vanessa helped with the pie. She was good in the kitchen, and I appreciated that she didn't try to make it Susan's pie, didn't try to replicate something she'd never tasted. She made her own thing, and it was good. But somewhere between dessert and coffee, the conversation drifted again toward money. Property values in Denver. The equity in my house in Lakewood, whether I planned to sell someday or leave it to my son. I answered honestly because there was no reason not to. My house was paid off. I'd lived there for 22 years. I had no immediate plans. But yes, eventually, my son would inherit it. She asked a follow-up question about what the lot was zoned for. I told her. Then I moved on. The third time, as I said, was the kitchen table and the chili. And after that came the fourth time, and the fifth. And somewhere around the fifth, the cold feeling in my chest stopped being small. I didn't say anything to my son yet. I had nothing concrete. I had a series of polite dinner table questions and a feeling in my gut that I couldn't explain to anyone without sounding like a paranoid old man who couldn't accept that his son had found happiness. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. I had watched enough friends lose their children over exactly that kind of accusation. The suspicious father, the jealous parent, the one who couldn't let go. I wasn't going to be that. I needed to know what I was actually dealing with before I opened my mouth. So I started quietly. I'm an engineer. I document. I observe. I don't act on intuition alone. I follow the data. I pulled up her hospital on LinkedIn first. Searched the staff directory on their website. There was no Vanessa listed in nursing staff. That wasn't necessarily alarming. Not everyone maintained a professional profile, and hospital staff listings were often incomplete. So, I went a step further. I called the hospital, said I was trying to send a thank you note to a nurse who had cared for my granddaughter and I wanted to make sure I had the right department. The woman on the phone was patient. She checked. There was no one by that name currently on staff in pediatrics. She checked all of nursing. Nothing. I sat with that for a long time. It still wasn't proof of anything terrible. People changed jobs. Maybe she had transferred recently and hadn't updated things. Maybe she had given my son a slightly different version of her employer. There could be a dozen innocent explanations. So I kept going. I have a friend from my working years, a man named Gary, who spent 20 years in county records before he retired. Gary knows how to find things. I called him on a Wednesday afternoon and told him I needed help doing a background check on someone, that I was worried about my son. Gary didn't ask a lot of questions. He said, "Give me a few days." 5 days later, Gary called me back. The woman my son knew as Vanessa did exist, but the details she had given him were layered over a very different history. She had worked at a medical clinic 4 years ago, briefly, as an administrative assistant, not as a nurse. She had no nursing degree from the university she had mentioned to my son. She had a civil judgment against her from 3 years ago. A former boyfriend had sued her successfully for nearly $18,000. Money she had borrowed and never repaid, and she had a different last name then. She had legally changed her name about 2.5 years ago. I wrote all of this down in my notebook. The same kind of engineer's notebook I'd used for 30 years. The green, hardcover kind with the graph paper inside. I wrote it in neat columns. Date, source, detail. Then I sat at my kitchen table alone and looked at it for a long time. My son was in love. He had been building his life back, piece by piece, after his mother died, and he had built this woman into the center of it. He had told me 3 weeks earlier, on a Sunday phone call, that he was thinking about proposing. He had asked me what I thought. I had said she seemed wonderful, because at that point I had not yet made my calls. Now I knew what I knew, and I had to decide what to do with it. The engagement party was already planned. My son had called me 4 days after Gary called me. His voice lit up from the inside, and told me that he had proposed at Red Rocks the night before, that she had said yes, that they wanted to celebrate with family and close friends the following Saturday at a restaurant downtown. I said congratulations. I meant it, and I didn't mean it at the same time. I felt sick. I thought about calling him immediately and telling him everything over the phone. But I knew my son. He was going to push back. He was going to want to defend her. And if I came at him with a folder of information while he was still floating on the happiness of the proposal, he was going to hear it as an attack, not as love. He was going to choose her, at least in that first moment, and I was going to lose the chance to reach him at all. I decided to wait until I could be with him in person. I decided the engagement party was my moment. The restaurant was a place called Ember, nice but not formal. The kind of place with exposed brick and good wine and small plates meant for sharing. There were about 20 people there. His college friends, her 2 girlfriends who I was meeting for the first time, my son's cousin from Albuquerque who had made the drive up. I sat near the head of the table and I watched Vanessa work the room. She was good at it. She was very, very good at it. She had a story for each person, a genuine seeming interest in whatever anyone was saying, a laugh that arrived right on cue. I watched her clock the room the way I was clocking it, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. She noticed me watching. She came and sat beside me during the cocktail hour, before everyone was seated, and she was warm and attentive and asked about a bridge project I had mentioned weeks earlier. She remembered the details. I gave her credit for that. "You must be so proud of him," she said. "Every day of my life," I said. And I meant that part entirely. We were seated for dinner. The courses came. The conversation was good and loud and overlapping the way it should be at a celebration. I waited. I had the notebook in my jacket pocket, not the original, but a summary I'd written out cleanly on 2 folded pages. I had not decided yet exactly how I was going to handle this. I only knew that I needed to get my son alone before the evening ended, before they drove home together, before another night passed with him not knowing. It was somewhere between the main course and dessert when my son reached across the table. He didn't say anything. He had been laughing at something his friend from college had said, and then his expression shifted, a small, almost invisible shift, the way a room looks different when a cloud passes over the sun. He reached across the table with his right hand, and laid something beside my bread plate. A folded piece of paper torn from what looked like the paper liner they put under the dishes here. I picked it up. I unfolded it under the table. It said, "Dad, I need 5 minutes alone with you. Don't make it obvious. Bathroom. 10 minutes. I refolded it and put it in my pocket and finished the bite I was chewing and laughed at something someone said across the table. I waited 11 minutes, counted them on my watch. Then I excused myself. My son was already in the small hallway outside the men's room, standing with his arms crossed and his back against the wall. He looked the way he had looked as a teenager when something had gone wrong at school. That specific combination of trying to be composed and not quite managing it. "Tell me what you know," he said. I looked at him for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I've seen you watching her all night," he said. "I know that look. You had that look the one time I brought home a used car that I thought was a great deal, and you knew in 30 seconds it was a lemon. You've had that look since before we sat down. So tell me." I took the 2 pages out of my jacket pocket. He read them standing there in the hallway. He read them slowly. I watched his face, and I kept my own face as steady as I could because I knew he needed me steady right now. When he finished, he folded the pages the way I had folded them and stood very still. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About 10 days, I said. "You should have told me sooner." "I know," I said. "I thought about it. I made a bad call on the timing. I'm sorry for that." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I found something too. That's why I passed you the note. I found something on her phone 2 nights ago when she left it unlocked on the counter. I wasn't snooping. It was just there. She had a message thread that I wasn't supposed to see." He paused. "She's been talking to someone. A man. About my inheritance. About what the house in Lakewood is worth. About how long they thought she'd need to stay with me before she could access joint finances." The hallway was very quiet. "How long ago did the thread start?" I asked. "Before she said yes to the proposal," he said. I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder, and he let me leave it there. He was 34 years old, and he was trying very hard not to fall apart in a restaurant hallway, and I was his father, and this was the thing I could do. I kept my hand on his shoulder. "Okay," I said. "Here's what we're going to do." We talked for 6 minutes. We had a plan. We went back to the table at different times. Him first, me 2 minutes later. I ordered dessert. I made conversation. I watched Vanessa tell a funny story about a hiking trail in Estes Park, and I kept my face pleasant and open, and I thought about my wife and what Susan would have done in this moment. She would have been better at the face than I was. She always was. But I managed. After dessert, as the table began to loosen and people started saying their goodbyes, my son leaned over to Vanessa and said he'd forgotten to give his father something from the car. Would she excuse him for 2 minutes? She said, of course. He caught the eye of his cousin from Albuquerque, who had been our one inside person for the last 20 minutes. His cousin touched his girlfriend's hand and said they needed to call it a night. They had the drive back, and would Vanessa like company while she waited? Vanessa said yes. My son and I walked out together. The man from the phone thread was not there. Of course, that wasn't what we were doing. We weren't looking for a confrontation at the restaurant. We were doing what I should have done from the start. We were getting him away from her cleanly, in public, with witnesses around, so that no one did anything dramatic, and no one said anything that couldn't be unsaid. My son handed the valet his ticket. While we waited, he said, "She's going to come out." "I know," I said. "I don't know what to say to her." "You don't have to say much tonight," I said. "You just have to get through tonight. Everything else comes after." The car came. He looked at me over the roof of it. "Dad," he said, "how did you know?" "From the beginning. How did you know?" I thought about that. I thought about 31 years of bridges and load calculations and stress tests. I thought about Susan telling me I had a nose for fault lines and things. She asked about my pension 3 times, I said, and each time she asked a more specific question than the last time. Someone who's just making conversation doesn't do that. Someone who's taking inventory does. He nodded slowly. "Go," I said. "I'll handle the goodbyes." I went back inside. Vanessa was still at the table with his cousin and his cousin's girlfriend, laughing about something, completely at ease. I sat down across from her, and I stayed very calm. "He had to step out for a bit," I said. "He's not feeling great. Too much wine, probably." I smiled. "You know how he is." She tilted her head. "Should I go check on him?" "He'll be fine," I said. "He just needed air." She looked at me for a beat longer than necessary. I have been told over the years that I have a particular expression I use when I know something that the other person doesn't know I know. I don't know what my face does exactly. Susan tried to describe it once. She said it looked like a man watching a clock count down from the outside of a locked room. Patient, certain, not unkind, but not open either. Whatever my face did in that moment, Vanessa saw it. She excused herself 5 minutes later, said she wanted to check on him, walked out, and that was the last time I saw her in a social setting. Over the following weeks, my son went through the process of unwinding the engagement with a quietness that reminded me of how he had grieved his mother, careful, private, determined. He met with her once, alone, in a coffee shop, and told her what he had found. She denied the phone messages at first, then minimized them, then tried a version of events in which she was the misunderstood one. He listened to all of it. Then he said goodbye. She did not take it gracefully. There were phone calls. There were a few days where he had to block several numbers. His cousin down in Albuquerque called him every evening that week, sometimes just to talk about nothing, which I was glad for. There was no dramatic scene. There was no public arrest. No confrontation in front of witnesses. No moment where anyone could photograph the wreckage and send it around. My son had a broken engagement and a hard month, and that was painful, but it was survivable. That was the thing Susan always said about pain: survivable is enough. You don't need it to be anything else right away. Just survivable. I drove up from Lakewood 3 Sundays in a row and made chili and watched basketball and didn't ask him how he was feeling unless he brought it up first. The 4th Sunday, he brought it up first. We talked for a long time. He asked me about the beginning of his mother and me, how I knew she was real, how I knew she meant what she said. I told him the honest answer, which is that I didn't know for certain, not in the first weeks, maybe not even in the first year. I told him that trust wasn't a conclusion you reached. It was a practice you maintained. You paid attention. You noticed the small things. And when the small things added up wrong, you paid attention to that too. "You paid attention," he said. "That's the whole job," I said. He looked out the window at the backyard, the yard that Susan had planted full of Colorado wildflowers and that I had let go a little wild since she was gone. "I'm going to take a while before I date again," he said. "Good idea," I said. "But I will. Eventually. Date again." "Good idea," I said again. He laughed. It was the full laugh, the one I hadn't heard in a few weeks. It was Susan's laugh in a lower register. The same rhythm. The same way it arrived faster than you expected. "I keep thinking," he said, "what if I hadn't found that thread? What if I hadn't seen the phone? What if she had been more careful?" I was quiet for a moment. "You would have found something else," I said. "You're your mother's son. She was the one who taught you to pay attention. I just reminded you." He thought about that. The wildflowers were starting to come up in the backyard. They come up every spring without any help. Self-seeding. The way Susan chose them deliberately because she said she didn't want a garden that depended on her. She wanted it to keep going. Out the window, the columbines were beginning to push through purple and white and stubborn. There's a version of this story that ends with something louder. A scene in a restaurant with raised voices. A phone screen turned outward to show everyone the proof, the sharp satisfaction of a public unmasking. I won't pretend I never imagined that version. I'm human. There's a part of me that wanted the catharsis of it, the moment where everyone in the room understood exactly what kind of person she was. But I thought about my son waking up the morning after that scene. I thought about him having to carry not just the grief of a broken engagement, but the image of himself at a table surrounded by his friends, while his private life came apart like a structure with too much load on a faulty foundation. He didn't need that. He needed to get out intact. That's the whole engineering problem. When you find a compromised bridge, you don't blow it up in rush hour traffic to prove a point. You close it carefully. You reroute. You let the right people do their work quietly. You protect the people on it. He's doing all right now. He's running again. He calls twice a week. He started coaching a junior running club on Tuesday evenings, kids from the middle school near his apartment, and he comes home from it tired in the good way. A few weeks ago, he called me on a Sunday evening, later than usual. He said he'd been thinking about something and wanted to ask me a question. He said, "Did Mom ever have a gut feeling about someone that turned out to be wrong?" I thought about it for a real moment. I went back through 33 years. Once, I said. She was absolutely convinced that our neighbor Dave was hiding something terrible. Watched him like a hawk for 4 months. Turned out he was planning a surprise party for his wife's 40th and needed to keep it secret. My son laughed again. The good laugh. "So it's not a perfect system," he said. "Nothing is," I said. "You watch anyway. You document anyway. You have someone you trust, and you tell them what you're seeing. And when the data comes back, you believe it." "Who did you trust?" he asked. "When you were figuring out Vanessa?" "Gary from County Records," I said. "And your mother?" He was quiet. "Mom's not here." "I know," I said. But I talked to her anyway. In the backyard, while the columbines were coming up, I said, "Susan, I don't know if I'm reading this right, and I need you to tell me if I'm wrong." And then I went back to the table, and I looked at my notes again, and the notes hadn't changed. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's not crazy," he said finally. "No," I said. "It isn't." I got up from the kitchen table after we hung up, and I walked through the house. The living room with the reading chair Susan picked out, the hallway with the framed photographs, the back door that sticks a little in humidity, and I went out into the backyard in the early evening dark. The columbines were closed for the night. The way they do. They'll open again tomorrow. They always do. I stood there for a while, my hands in my jacket pockets, listening to the neighborhood sounds. A dog somewhere 2 streets over. A car turning slowly at the end of the block. I have been a father for 34 years. I have learned that you cannot build a wall around the people you love and call it protection. You can only pay attention. You can only be present and honest and willing to say the hard thing at the right moment in the right way. You can only make sure they know that when they pass you a folded piece of paper across a table and say, "I need you," you will still be there, still steady, still reading the load-bearing structures of the world around them. That is the whole job. The whole thing. Susan knew that long before I did. She was always the better engineer of the two of us, really. She just built different things.